in the summer, at least. I'm a philosopher, sometimes a cognitive scientist or a philosopher of cognitive science, and I'm interested in the idea of group cognition. So let me begin to ask questions, like something like, who thinks that groups can act? Raise your hand. Oh, almost everybody. I was expecting you not to raise. Can groups think? After 2 weeks of the summer school, and sort of slight bias being introduced. Can groups feel? So, Bryce, shouldn't you sort of, or you? Oh no, okay, no, okay. Good. Well, that's my point. Actually, is that asking these questions to begin with might not be the best place to start. Can groups have a mind? Oh, so now there's only like 3. Oh, now you got Bryce. Okay. Well, as a philosopher, if you ask these kinds of questions to begin with, you very often get into these kinds of fistfights, arguments that I now characterize as sort of Camptoni versus Campkunis. Why do I characterize them that way? Camptoni is named after the tennis player Rafael Nadal and his Uncle Tony, because whenever Uncle Tony talks about Rafael Nadal, he refers to them as a kind of plural entity. So he's saying things like, we have a problem with our serve. Sometimes when you serve quickly, the ball comes back so fast, so for our game, it is better not to have so much speed in the point. So he talks about our serving. Even actually you might think, well, who's serving, Nadal or Tony? So that sort of Camptoni is the people who might sort of overshoot in terms of their claims that groups can think or have a mind or feel. And then you have Campkunis, named after the recent appearance by Mila Kunis on the Jimmy Kimmel show. Too soon to be dad, stop saying we are pregnant. I'm not going to show you the video, but here's a quote. You are not pregnant. Do you squeeze a watermelon-sized person out of your lady hole? No. Are you crying alone in your car listening to a stupid Bette Midler song? No. So they say any kind of talk about we think group cognition is hopelessly metaphorical at best and false at worst. So sort of Rob Rupert is the Kunis of the extended mind hypothesis. Good to have him. So this is how these debates sort of sometimes go. So I want to today suggest that we can sort of move a little bit beyond the Camptoni versus Campkunis debate. And as a philosopher, I'm interested in drawing some sort of principled distinctions and taxonomies. It's a fun thing to do. I'll try to sort of identify generic components that may underlie different conceptualizations of similar group phenomena, different parts of the intellectual landscape. We'll also identify discipline-specific contributions, concepts, theories, measurements, methodologies that people might not be aware of, as we've already done today and the whole summer school. Suggest possibilities for cross-fertilizing research in those areas, and generally think about the philosophical foundations of mind, cognition, sociality. So here's what I'm going to do today is a kind of really only a bird's eye kind of view, which hopefully will trigger a lot of responses, thoughts, helpful suggestions, comments, criticisms, but sort of my way of drawing and sort of giving you kind of signposts to help you navigate an intellectual landscape that's very scattered. People just read the literature in their little field. They're completely unaware of literature about group cognition in other areas. So here's the kind of architecture of my thinking. I'm going to begin with talking about what I'm now calling the scaffolded joint action model. And the idea is I'm not even going to be using the C word, the cognition word. I'm also not using the E word, the extended inactive mind word, much to your delight, I'm sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychological infrastructure of human collaborative activities. I'm talking about the transition from individual intentionality to joint intentionality to collective intentionality. And I'm talking about things that are inside the head, things that people bring to collaborative activities that are in the world. A little bit about cultural evolution and scaffolded joint and collective action. Once we have that model, we can then, I think, move from collective and joint action to collective and joint cognition. So my argument will be, I think we can move from the architecture of joint intentionality to get what I call distributed cognition, and we can move from the architecture of collective intentionality to what I call collective cognition. And then we can have more elaborate scaffolded forms of both varieties of group cognition. As we move along, I'm going to talk about the sense in which group cognition can be said to be emergent. I've written a bunch of papers on this. You can sort of read that. I'm going to mostly skip technicalities today. And then we'll get to some illustrations, applications, complications. I had like 40 or 50 slides of that, and I decided like in the middle of the night to sort of drop them and rather sort of make this a more collaborative enterprise. So my talk might actually be over after 30 minutes, I think, but I don't know, who knows? It's the first time I'm giving this talk. And then hopefully we'll generate ideas, suggestions, comments. And the idea is that in theory, my taxonomy should allow you to classify all types of group cognition. Okay. So, what is a scaffolded joint action? This is one I argue, right? Pointing to the example. But what makes a scaffolded joint action that? So let's begin with the simpler question, what's a joint action to begin with? Let's start with examples to distinguish what I call joint action with parallel individual actions. By the way, first question is, how many people in the audience know about the literature on joint action that originates in philosophy but it sort of now radiates into psychology, organization science, economics? Only a few. So it's a good sort of to review a little bit. The distinction here, let's begin with some examples. Here's a joint action. The members of a flash mob simultaneously open their newspapers noisily, somewhere in public. The parallel individual actions, the onlookers simultaneously happen to open their newspapers noisily, in a totally sort of uncoordinated way. Another example. Singing a duet, singing in parallel. I'm going to give you a better definition, of course, but more distinctions between joint action and socially aggregated or coordinated individual actions. So, for instance, mixed motive interactions like social dilemmas, prisoner dilemma, tragedy of the commons, public goods problems, those are not joint actions. Choosing on which side of the road to drive, socially interdependent individual actions, coordination problems, are not joint actions in that sense. Playing rock, paper, scissors, discoordination problems, not joint actions in that sense. So my account sort of borrows very broadly from planning-theoretic accounts of joint action as they have been developed in multiple books and papers and publications by philosopher Michael Bratman, a recent book on shared agency, and anthropologist Michael Tomasello. So pick those two individuals. Who knows about that sort of stuff? Raise your... It's relevant to your work. So, okay. So let's begin with I call individual intentional activity. And by the way, I'm using intentionality not in the technical philosopher sense, but sort of pretty much in the ordinary sense, the kind of psychological infrastructure people bring to the table to perform intentional actions. That's pretty much how I use the term. So here's this sort of diagram from Tomasello, what's going on when you perform such a basic action, such as using a key to open a box. You have a goal. You have a certain knowledge of your skills, of your expertise. You have a model of the current reality. You undergo through some sort of decision-making process, means ends, rationality, and so on. And you form an intention which Bratman identifies with an action plan, how to actually achieve the goal of opening the box. And then you start monitoring. Was your action carried out properly? What was the effect of the action on reality? What was the result? Was it a failure? Was it a success? Was it an accident? And you keep sort of moving towards the goal. So, the way that sort of you can put this, action plans coordinate temporally interconnected individual agency. You're acting in the here and now, but your actions are part of the larger temporal arc. What you're doing next is determined by your plans about what your future self, sort of, what the state of your future self, what the future state of the world should be like. So you can sort of take the basic structure of this capacity and add to joint collaborative activities, again following Bratman, Tomasello here. So you have two agents, and they have not one goal, but they have a shared goal. The goal is to open the box, because I also know that you have the same goal of opening the box, and I know about that. And in my decision-making process, I take into consideration my knowledge of your skills, and I form a joint intention of opening the box together with you. I want you to be part of it. So for instance, in this case, I'm still not entirely sure why they use like a key and pliers. A more better example would be like using one person is using the key, the other person is holding the box, right? Oh, you can do that, you don't need the key, right? That sort of stuff. So you have a joint intention, and also you have joint attention, because now you're paying attention to not only what I'm doing, but I'm monitoring to what you're doing. I'm also paying attention to the fact that you're paying attention, and so on. That's what's being called joint attention or mutual knowledge in this case. So one could say that joint action plans help to coordinate socially interconnected or joint agency, like temporal planning agency socially extended, right? So here's how Bratman sort of defines something like what I'm going to call joint collaborative activities. Two or more agents who jointly collaborate typically coordinate or mesh their subplans and plans, which are very often partial in nature, and actions in ways that track the joint goal. Why do I say partial? Because you don't always specify all the details of what you're going to do in advance. You sort of play it by ear. Right? You might sort of use some situationally appropriate techniques. You might have to revise it. There's obstacles and so on. You're opportunistic. You have an appropriate commitment, though perhaps for different reasons. Reasons do not factor into that model, actually, to the joint activity. And you have a commitment to ensure a mutual responsiveness to each other's actions and plans. And you have a commitment to support one another, playing their respective parts if the need arises. Helping, right? So let me actually make a point about this, what I'm going to call, Tomasello, the dual level structure of joint action. There is a sense in which certain things are shared. For instance, there's a joint goal, but the individual roles that people play in the pursuit of the joint goal are potentially distinct, potentially reversible, and simultaneously carried out. And each collaborator must be able to represent those things in a common representational format. And the same thing, the same duality of social sharedness and individual differentiation, you get at the level of joint attention. You have to be able to both attend to the kind of same things, but you also have to understand that people adopt different perspectives. By that, I don't just mean the simple fact that if you stand around the corner, you can see things that I don't see. That's not what I mean. The idea is we both look at the same thing, but things appear to us in a different way. For me, it's a horse. For you, it's a pony. Lifting a bench, for me, it's a way of sort of getting to move. For you, it's opportunity to exercise, right? That's what I mean by perspective. So that will, again, be differentiated. And I got to, as an agent, be able to represent both inside the head, if you wish. So the next question to ask now is, how can we classify the ways in which individual contributions or roles, X and Y, are combined or meshed in the pursuit of a joint goal? And here we can avail ourselves of a different, totally disconnected kind of literature that's been developed by this guy. Who is this guy? Does anybody know who this is? I wouldn't have known it either, because even though I know his work, but I've never seen a picture. But thanks to Google, a picture of this person comes up. This is Ivan Steiner. Who knows Ivan Steiner? Only people who are like, well, because I've been citing him. He's like one of the popes of sort of small group research on group performance. You know his work, but a minority. And he sort of classified group coordination problems in terms of their task demands. The visibility of the task, the desired type of output, and the type of combination process. I think it's actually a pretty useful classification for philosophical purposes, so I'm going to briefly review Stein's task taxonomy. So first, you distinguish between task types. Some tasks are divisible, which means you have identifiable subcomponents that you can assign to specific members, like playing football, preparing a 6-course meal. Some are pretty unitary. There's no real subcomponents. pulling on a rope, and you cannot, that task itself, you cannot really divide that up, maybe, or reading a book. Then you have maximizing versus optimizing tasks. In one case, quantity matters, generating as many ideas as possible, or tug of war, or quality matters. In the other case, generating good ideas or finding the shortest path, etc. Then you have a distinction between intellective and judgmental tasks, which plays a big role in this debate. Intellective tasks have a demonstrably correct solution, math problems, history, trivia, that stuff. Judgmental tasks are based on evaluative judgments. Jury's decision, perhaps, American Idol falls in this category. More interesting, actually, the taxonomy based on various kinds of social combination processes. And notice I'm still talking about activities. I'm not talking about group cognition or anything. On one extreme, you have purely additive combination, where you add the inputs in a purely summative way. Examples, pulling a rope, shoveling snow. Many people. Compensatory tasks are tasks where the individual inputs are being averaged. So one example of collective intelligence that Professor Malone gave us, wisdom of the crowd and prediction markets, are sophisticated versions of what is known as compensatory tasks in social small group research. Still, the interdependence and interaction is fairly minimal, which sort of plays to the advantage of the collective because there's no herding, information cascades, and conformity, etc. Adding more social interactivity, you get disjunctive tasks. You generate a single outcome that will stand for the group. You pick one person's answer as the answer for the group. You pick one art project to represent the school. Now, each of us solves the problem, so the interaction consists in sort of social processes, convincing others to adopt my solution, for instance. Right. On the other end, you have conjunctive tasks where all group members contribute to an outcome, like mountain climbers roped together climbing a mountain. Think of cases in between. And then you have interesting complementary tasks, as Steiner called it originally, where you combine different but complementary inputs. That's what the cases like running a football play, orchestral performance, and many of the cases of distributed cognition that John and others have mentioned. Discretionary tasks where the group can decide how the inputs relate to a group outcome, like selecting a certain voting procedure to fix the group preference or group decision. So if you actually now look at this very famous saying that the unified whole is different from the sum of the parts, which is in some cases true, in others it's not true, what does that mean? Well, I think it has two aspects. Performance aspect, where you sort of compare group performance to individual performance benchmarks, better than best, better than worst, better than most, better than average, better than some, and so on. If it exists, right? In some tasks, hard to compare an orchestra with one person doing it all by himself or herself, but which shows you about the sort of limitations of this measure. And it can also refer to group organizations, various degrees of interdependence, or the density of interactions. Let's very briefly talk about the performance aspect. The law of group productivity, revised, would be something like this. The actual productivity, understood in a very general sense, is the potential productivity determined by the appropriate benchmark, minus losses that are owing to faulty processes, all sorts of things, social loafing, reduce the effort, free riding, let others do the work, coordination losses, and so on. You could call it an assembly malus, if you want. Plus the gains owing to good processes. Those are the things that are called the assembly bonus in that literature. Right? Things that are more than what individuals or the kind of summative or aggregative combination of those inputs could achieve. It's kind of the holy grail of small group research. The organizational aspect, I think, can be cashed out in terms of definition that Bill Wimsatt gave many years ago and that myself and other people have applied to the case of group cognition or group collaboration. You start defining a property or a performance P of a group G, as philosophers like to say, as being aggregative, just in case it satisfies a number of invariance conditions. What kind of invariance conditions? First, that the performance is invariant under the intersubstitution of the parts. Second, that the performance remains qualitatively similar under the addition or subtraction of the parts. There's no nonlinear effect. The performance is invariant under the decomposition and reaggregation of the parts. That's not true for size, right? If you sort of chop off my head and put it next to me, I lose a few inches, so to speak. So size is not fully emergent, not fully aggregative. Maybe mass is, right? There's no cooperative or inhibitory interactions among the parts. That's a crucial condition. So once you have those four, you can sort of define emergent properties conversely as being non-aggregative to some degree. That's just very similar to conceptions of being minimally decomposable that you find in Herb Simon, or the notion of emergence as synergy, Peter Corning's work, and many others. Okay, so those are the kind of concepts. Think about it, those two performance and organization aspect of emergence are not the same. If you look at this 2x2 table here between emergent and aggregative in the organization sense and the assembly bonus and assembly malus in the performance sense, you get a potential dissociation here. Well, on the one hand, if it's pure aggregative, you cannot get a bonus or malus. That's true. Like if you order 10 pounds of meat and the butcher only gives you 9.9, the butcher screwed you. You do not blame it on the loss of mysterious synergetic effects because mass is aggregative, right? But here it gets interesting. Yeah, if you have emergent organization, you can get an assembly bonus. But if you have an emergent organization, you can also get an assembly mass. Nicely shown by John's work yesterday, right? You could have a group of people who actually wants to get together, right? Their memories become shared, but inaccurate, right? So for instance, if we all individually watched the World Cup, we might think that Brazil really sucked. But if you watched all the Brazilian games on TV together with sort of drinking, the kind of shared memory we develop will be, oh yeah, well, the Brazilians played really well. It was too bad they lost against the Germans, right? Which might actually, right, if accuracy is your relevant measure, right, you actually, the group does much worse than the sum of the parts. However, so there's assembly malus. But on the other hand, it depends on what your performance measure is. If you're trying to maximize the bond or the cohesion, who cares about accuracy? We had a great time watching it, right? So you have emergence in the organization sense does not imply that it's always better. It just implies that it's different from the sum of the parts. So basically the idea is, so far I haven't even really talked about extended or distributed cognition. So the idea is you take the same architecture of joint intentionality that underlies basic forms of joint actions, like lifting a log, and you apply it to the performance of cognitive tasks. I think that covers really all the cases that people in various disciplines call socially distributed cognition. Right? You apply it to problem solving, learning, remembering, reasoning, artistic creation, etc. I've showed this in some detail for transactive memory, but I'm not going to do this here. Here's a nice list. One could now enumerate various academic disciplines, look at what kind of group level constructs they have investigated, and then see whether that can be sort of pressed into the framework of joint intentionality. I'm not going to go over all of this. This is actually taken from that's more than 10 years now, survey paper from a Journal of Organizational Behavior. OB is the people call that in organization science. They're considered sort of the micro people in organization science compared to people in management and sociology. And even just looking at this literature, there's like at least 5 frameworks that have operationalized this. The team mental model framework, literatures can be found in the papers I posted. The information sharing framework, speed up a little bit here. Transactive memory systems that has been already discussed by several people. Collective learning, it's a misnomer, should be called socially distributed learning because we get to collective cognition later on in my talk. Cognitive consensus literature, and so on. What's interesting about this is in this economy here that they describe these different paradigms as having a somewhat different emphasis. Some paradigms focus on the distributed aspect, for instance, of the task work, right? Transactive memory, you remember something I don't remember. Other focus on the overlapping aspects, But we both understand how to talk about errors. We both understand how to ask for suggestions. We both understand how to correct one another, right? Those kinds of things, social perceptiveness that Professor Malone talked about, would fall into this category. My claim is that really these are just different emphases, right? Those, in reality, right, the cognitive architecture that you need to have in order to engage in those all falls out of the dual level structure of joint intentionality, where you need to be able to represent socially shared things and individually differentiated things. Those are all applied the same architecture to cognitive tasks. Okay, so one might say here, okay, so fine, now one notion of emergence. Here's like, Keith Sawyer wrote a great book about, many great books about creativity, collaboration, etc. He says something like, the most transformative creativity results when the group either thinks of a new way to frame a problem or finds a new problem that no one had noticed before. When teams work this way, ideas are often transformed into questions and problems. That's critical because creativity researchers have discovered that the most creative groups are good at finding new problems rather than simply solving old ones. So the question is, well, isn't like, okay, so you have this task taxonomy, but the idea of novelty, creativity, unpredictability, how does that sort of fit into your framework? Well, there's really not a problem because you could sort of argue that in joint actions, in general, how much agents represent about each other's roles, perspective, plans, and maybe even goals can vary greatly. We don't fill in all the details. You could have sort of partial plans, partial representations of each other's knowledge and skills, which are revisable as you go along. So this, when I refer to the planning-theoretic account, I'm not saying that all of these things are always filled in from the beginning. They could be in some very routinized cases, but they don't have to be. So I think aspects or outcomes of distributed cognition that are unplanned or unintended, individually and jointly unintended, are emergent in that kind of sense of creativity or novelty or unpredictability, as we've argued in greater detail in that paper. I want to actually at this point also refer to a slightly different literature that's relevant here. It seems to be a very disembodied kind of approach that I've taken thus far. Embodied and situated coordination dynamics can facilitate or interfere with the representational joint intentionality that underlies distributed cognitive processes. And those would be examples like rhythmic entrainment, of postural sway, speech patterns, etc. Perception-action matching or mimicry. You observe somebody doing it, it sort of primes you to activate the same kind of action as if you would perform it. Action simulation, predictive models, things like joint action affordances, right? You have a long two-handled saw. Right? It's an action affordance for two people, right? To grab at two different ends of that saw, and so on. Okay, so far, we're still in the realm of joint collaborative activities applied to cognitive tasks. But now we're actually, I think, moving into a different kind of, following Tomasello, different kind of mindset that underlies what I'm going to call group collaborative activities. And these are all archetypes, like Weberian ideal types, if you wish. I'm talking about the synchronic coordination with in-group strangers through large-scale cooperative arrangements, and the diachronic coordination with ancestors and descendants through the transmission of knowledge and skills. Those are the kinds of large-scale organizations I have in mind here. And sort of Thomas' slogan, which I sort of like, is collective intentionality, again, as the kind of individual mindset that a person has to bring to the table in order to participate in those kinds of structures. It's not a group cognition thing, okay? Is essentially conventionalized joint intentionality. So there's kind of two conventionalizing effects of having a shared culture understood broadly. It could be the culture of a society, it could be the culture of a community, a university, academia, an organization, IBM, etc. One is coordinative. It gives you kind of implicit or explicit agreement to do things a certain way as long as others are willing to do the same. And it has a transmissive effect. Doing things in some agreed upon way automatically sets a precedent that can be copied by others. So here we have culturally shared norms and practices are kind of scaffolds, if you think about it, for coordinating one's behavior with that of anyone else in the group. Am I italicizing this? because I want to draw a distinction here between, to make this even more sort of perspicuous, between joint and collective intentionality. Joint intentionality is a kind of, again, paradigm forms. Second personal, direct engagement between self and a significant other, to use the words of George Herbert Mead. On the other hand, you have a transpersonal, indirect engagement with a generalized other. In the one case, the mutual responsiveness is based on perceptual common ground. In the other case, mutual responsiveness is based on cultural common ground. In one case, you have a second personal self-monitoring of your behavior based on the anticipated social evaluation by your present or future or potential collaborative partners. In the other case, you have a normative self-governance that's based on generic transpersonal group standards. We have a forthcoming paper in which we sort of apply these ideas to organizational learning, but what's important is you need that kind of mindset to develop larger kind of social organizations in a broad sense, which are assembled from a large pool of heterogeneous people with little or no overlap in domain-specific knowledge, skill, or perspective, which have an incentive to accumulate in-depth individual expertise. If I'm a mover, I can sort of specialize in becoming better at lifting benches because I'm going to do this for 20 years, right? If I'm only going to be in a joint mindset, I might only do it once. Might not pay off to get that kind of expertise. Which means you increase the potential of a greater assembly bonus effect stemming from either co-specialization or process gains or both. The development of stable role structures with associated status, rights, and responsibilities of the respective role bearers. And eventually, importantly, you represent enduring group efforts as institutionalized social entities in their own right. Here's you get the idea of a macro actor. And I think once you have this idea, this takes us then to the next step. The basic forms of what I'm going to call collective cognition, in the non-distributed sense, is when you talk about when you actually attribute cognitive or epistemic properties to macro actors. Things like collective beliefs and acceptances, collective desires and preferences, collective responsibility and guilt, collective epistemic agency, in the sense of making your own intentional life a kind of project, making sure that it's rationally unified, it coheres, caring about your own intellectual life. And in this case, caring about the epistemic coherence of the macro agent. That's kind of the mindset that underlies those cases, I think. Or a collective emotion. Bryce's paper. Okay. I think the basic idea, and that's the notion of emergence that sometimes pops up, is a kind of functionalistic understanding of emergence as a kind of multiple realizability, which goes back to Plato, famously in the Republic, pointed out kind of analogies in the cognitive architecture between the Republic and the soul. All right? In modern terms, there's a kind of relationship between mental states understood as functional states, which can be multiply realizable in different kinds of physical substrates, so you cannot identify it with any of them, which gives it a kind of irreducibility thesis. And of course, the argument is that, you can think about that agency or various other predicates could be realized by an individual, but it could be really realized by a macro agent too. But I think once you don't have the idea that there are stable role structures, for instance, that you can assign to various planning states, or there is enduring macro agents, then this doesn't even make sense. This doesn't even occur to you, so to speak. I think it sort of requires, historically, phylogenetically speaking, maybe if you wish, a kind of very abstract conceptions about how to think about groups as enduring entities in their own right. Like 5, how much is that? 5. Okay. So much for my idea of finishing in I thought it was done in 25 minutes, but okay. So, there are various ways of developing this. Margaret Gilbert, I said signposts. She comes from a more analytic philosophy tradition, and she has developed the idea of groups as plural subjects. Christian Pettit and Philip List have defended the idea of group agency based on theory of judgment aggregation, and Bryce Hübner has defended the idea of macrocognition, collective mentality, based on a more computational approach, but he's talked about his own work a few days ago. So again, we're still in this taxonomy. I haven't talked about scaffolding, but I think once you have, remember, group collaborative activity includes the long-term diachronic coordination between generations. Well, once you have this, then culturally specific skills, artifacts, and mode of social organization build on one another over historical time. kind of cumulative cultural evolution that's only possible if you have that. There's a kind of ratchet effect, as Tomasello calls it. And that's a theme of this entire conference, of course. Social and technological resources scaffold human collaborative practices and expand both distributed and collective forms of group cognition over space, time, and people. But I don't think that, take all the scaffolds you want, I don't think that the division between collective and distributed forms of group cognition will collapse. But there might be hybrid forms, there might be vastly expanded forms of collaboration, but that doesn't make it collective, I think, in this sense. So, we can talk about this in the question and answer session. Basically, the scaffolding allows people to tap into the accumulated wisdom of their cultural group and its history. So what's interesting, if you look at, in generally, at enculturated human activities, you can always look at it in at least 3 different dimensions. You can look at the actual conduct of the activity, here and now, solving a math problem. You can look at the development of the practitioners, or you can look at the development of the practice. So going back to my Uncle Tony example, like Nadal serving for the match. Maybe it's an extended body, right? Nadal with the racket. The practitioners, I don't know, Uncle Tony advising young ambidextrous Nadal to play with the left hand. Practice, right? The serve technique is entwined with the development of the racket technology. Those would be examples. And if you actually apply this to concrete cases, so a case where I would start now with sort of implications, applications, complications. So for instance, yesterday John mentioned this pretty famous study, like according to Google, it's been cited 45 times, not bad, by Mead and others about how expertise promotes facilitation on a collaborative memory task, right? I like that paper. So the idea is different people have to recall various aviation-related problems and problem scenarios. They have to either do it alone or have to do it in collaboration, right? Sorry. So what it turns out that non-pilots and novices are disrupted by the collaboration. Expert pilots showed collaborative facilitation. And then they did a verbal protocol analysis to see why that's the case. Right? So it could be either due to an increased domain-specific knowledge, that's what I call co-specialization, or general collaborative skills. And it turns out that the biggest difference between the experts and the novices and non-pilots is, on the one hand, it's not necessarily the corrections, it's not so much the explanations, but it's the elaborations. Like they build on each other what they say. They fill out certain gaps, they know what's sort of being left out, they ask for input and help. And in terms of collaborative skills, it's actually mostly based not on acknowledgement, like, yeah. It's not very helpful at all. Everybody does that. What they do is they repeat each other's statements back. You think about that copy that, right? Or restatements. They sort of slightly reframe it in a way that's more accurate. So one could sort of, there's studies in psychology that show how these kinds of repetitions and restatements strengthen joint attention mechanisms, right? Which help the pilots to attend to the relevant information of the aviation area. So on the one hand, you could say, that fits exactly with my joint intentionality story. But if you think about it, there's multiple levels here. Because if you look at it from you could look at it from a collective standpoint, the pilots would never invest that much energy. They undergo crew resource management. They get trained to collaborate that way with the crew, with the air control center, and so on. If they wouldn't be in a long-standing organization, they wouldn't develop those kinds of skills. So those are kind of social, cultural scaffolds that they have. Does it make it a great case of collective cognition? No. If anything, it makes it a case of distributed cognition as applied to remembering. I'm going to stop here because I'm running out of time. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we can sort of discuss some other interesting cases.